Dr. Greenspan is a psychologist and a playwright at the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor. Came all the way from, I think, is it colder there then?
Yeah, kind of.
Kind
We
of.
didn't get the crazy storms you all got. So,
Oh, okay.
yeah.
But they're way north. But anyway, University of Michigan, as you know, is a great school. He has degrees from both Harvard and Brandeis University. He's been interviewing Holocaust survivors for the last 25 or more years.
40 plus.
40 plus. So his presentation is based on those interviews. And I know Cindy and I saw him, and it's very exciting and gives us insights that perhaps we can't get in other ways, although there's lots of ways to do it. So with all that saying, Dr. Greenspan.
Thank you. Thank you, Ron. And obviously, thank you all for coming. As you heard, I spent a good part of my life and an important part in this part of the country. You may hear in my voice, I'm actually from New York originally, but I kind of converted to being a New England person for a long time, and then I had to adjust to being a Michigan person, which I'm still waiting to happen, honestly. You know, home is home, right? So East is East, and that's how it is. Is it not on? Because I thought we turned it on. How is, let's go up the chain here a little bit. Yeah, I'm glad, thank you for letting me know. How is that? Is that better? Not really. Huh. I'm going to ask the people in the back. You can hear you well? Okay. I mean, what I usually ask people to do is what I call the Nixon, which is, those of you who are a certain age will know what I'm doing. If you can't hear, do that. Right? Top of the, just getting on the plane, heading out. Right? So don't say anything necessarily in the middle, right? But just give me the Nixon, if you can't hear, and then I'll tweak it up. Is that okay over here now? Not great. So we go a little higher, because then you get reverb. Anyway, but I tend to, well, it's come up. Okay, so yeah, that actually, so it's a little too high. It's good? All right. I'll try to look left and right. My wife tells me I'm always looking there, but that won't work today. Anyway, so yeah, as Ron said, I started interviewing it's now like 43 years ago, in the mid-'70s, survivors. And the reason I mention that, besides the kind of amazingness to me after all these years, is that in those days, there was not a clear model. I don't think there was video camera then. And if there were, I wouldn't have used it, to be honest. I'm an audio guy. And, a little audio cassette, as we used to have, would just sort of sit on the table and you'd forget about it. So in the 70s, not having a model meant that survivors and I had the freedom to make it up as we went along. I mean, to decide, how are we going to do this? My background is, in part, a psychologist. None of this, I want to say, was therapy, except maybe for me. But it was in no way therapy. But, psychologists tend to assume, and I did, that if you're going to talk about something like this, you're probably going to need more than one meeting to do it justice and to get anywhere and to let people develop things and the trust and working together and so on. So that's how it evolved. And so people said, effectively, come back next week, we'll talk some more. I was in grad school at the time. Somehow my committee let me go into this without a clear, quote, methodology, as we said today. So I could do that. And I also, as a psychologist, I didn't assume that it would necessarily be the same number of meetings with each person. Why should it be? Some people would want to talk less. Some people would want to talk more. And there was no, it was as long as it seemed mutually useful and as it continued to develop. And some of that is chemistry, some of that's a lot of things. So the result was that with some people I met over a period of months, maybe 5, 6, 7, 8 times. With some people it was years. With a few people it was decades. Not a lot, but a few people. So these are obviously, especially in the latter two categories, people who became friends. I mean, this is very different than walking into a studio in spending 2 or 3 hours in front of a video camera. As Ron knows, and this is one of my little things, I do not use the word testimony to describe what I have heard, because friends don't give testimony to friends. Maybe they do, but that harks back to a commercial that most of you are too young to have remembered. But you know, people talk, people remember things about the war. They're not doing it in my interviews, which were hardly even interviews. Eventually, they were conversations, in order to archive something. I mean, a testimony is a very important word, but it means, in my world, something very specific. It's for the record. It's for posterity. It's as permanent as it can be, and you put it in the archive, and then it's there. This was not like that. This is two people who got to know each other well, talking, exploring. As I sometimes say, testimony is like declaration. This is what I witnessed. This is what I saw. This is what I believe is true. As, you know, it doesn't need to be in a court situation, but that's why we call court testimony is like that. Two people talking is more like exploration than it is declaration. So really, that's what we did over these years. And again, especially with the people with whom I spoke a long time. As you would imagine, in the early interviews, it was more like testimony in the sense that, of course, my interest was wanting to know what happened during the war, and et cetera, what did you witness? And then it became more exploratory, and then all kinds of things, including about us. And you'll hear that, because a lot of this piece is actually as much about us, meaning survivors' listeners, or lack thereof, or listeners in a certain way, as it is about survivors themselves. That became, for them, I think, one of the things that they wanted to talk about as we proceeded, and I was very interested in, I will say. The very first person I interviewed was back in '71. It was an accident. It was for another project, and he told me I was the first, quote, American, meaning born in the U.S. after the war, barely, with whom he'd spoken at all. And many of you will know that in general, always exceptions, but in general, survivors did not speak much in public until late 70s, early 80s. This was a large testimony project. Of course, there were exceptions. Elie Wiesel's memoir, you know, Night, was already published in the 60s, et cetera. But in terms of the scale that we have now, it, for the most part, didn't exist. Why that is another question. Maybe we can talk about it. The post-performance discussion is really my favorite part of this whole event, so I'll get to it. But last thing, two last things. When you know people well, as I got to know, I had the great pleasure, and I don't even know what to call it. It's been my life that I happened to come up when survivors were ready in a certain way to talk. It just happened to go that way. People will say, will remember something. Maybe they've told you the story before. We all do this with friends. But at these moments, it's kind of like they find a way of saying it. Maybe an image, or a particular memory, or just the cadence of speech, which kind of nails it. And you know when that happens. This happens, you know, and again, none of this is therapy, but you know, in the world of therapy, that also happens when you're working with someone and they just kind of like, that's how it was. These are gifts, in my view. You can't do much except get out of the way, you know, when this kind of thing happens. But I mention this because what this piece is very condensed, and it is really a gathering, a collection of those kinds of gifts, those kinds of special moments. So it is not typical testimony. It's not typical anything, right? Because nobody does that. None of us nail something that often, right? I mean, maybe if we're poets, we do, but in general, we don't. So I say that again to suggest the piece. Other thing, I'm so used to see students, but this is for all of us. If you can make sure your cell phone's off, I would appreciate it, and not out, because it'd be a little distracting to me. I always fear when I hear that, like I'm going to turn mine on by mistake. But anyway, I appreciate it. Okay, there are both men and women represented. And I will say, there are different segments. I'll tell you the title of that segment, and I'll tell you if it's a man or a woman. will be perhaps evident. But anyway, it's how the piece is structured, and I begin with a very brief narrator's introduction. Remnants. The voices of Holocaust survivors are themselves survivors. Each must draw on words and cadences that once belonged to entire communities, even while retelling how those communities were destroyed. And each must persist with a remembered terror that can still consume a voice, and sometimes does. Remnants is a gathering of such voices. Voice, a woman. During the war, I lost my voice. I literally lost my voice. I was a little kid at that time, little pisher, like we say in Yiddish. I was 8 years old. At that time, I lost my voice. This was in 1943 in the ghetto. It was after one of those actions. You know, when the SS come in and they kill a lot of people, and they round up the others and they take them to the train. The train takes them away. After one of those actions, I lost my voice. I don't know why, but for 2 years, I did not speak a single word. After the war, my voice came back. Not right away, but very slowly. This was in 1945 in a DP camp, a camp for displaced persons, mostly for Jews who had survived the war. During the day in that camp, I did not speak at all. But at night, when I was having a nightmare, I screamed. So that was how we knew I still had a voice, because during the day I was completely mute. During the night I screamed. There was a doctor at that camp, Jewish doctor, who said, if the girl can scream in the night when she's asleep, so she can scream in the day when she's awake. And if she can scream in the day, so she can also sing or cry. If she can sing or cry, she can speak words as well. The voice can be salvaged. The screams can be refined into cries. Cries can be refined into words. So the doctor tried to help me. He took me to run in the hills near that camp, and he had me run with my mouth open so I could feel the air push up against my throat. And he told me to try to scream with the air in my throat, or make any sound at all. And soon I did start to scream when I was running. Then I was crying, making other different sounds. And eventually, the sounds became a voice. I could speak words again after 2 years of no words at all. Today, we have many words about the Holocaust. We argue, what does it mean? What should we do? What should we have done at the time? We argue for God and against Him, for Israel and against Israel, for reaching out to others and against reaching out to others. We argue and we reflect. We argue some more. But to me, when I think about the Holocaust, I remember the doctor. And I remember myself when I was a young girl running in the hills. Because to me, all are words. whatever we say about the Holocaust are just so many different refinements of a scream. And the scream is just barely salvaged from a cry. And the cry is just barely salvaged from the silence. Mars, a man. In the beginning, right after the war, we wanted to talk about it. I mean, if we could talk about it, we wanted to talk about it. We needed to talk about it. I wanted to talk about it a lot, but nobody wanted to hear. Like when I first came to this country, nobody wanted to hear about the Holocaust. I mean, nobody wanted to hear about it. My own cousin, dentist in California, I met when I first came over here. He said to me also, first he said, Manny, I know what you went through. I saw the newsreels. I don't want to hear a word about it. That's what he said to me. I saw the newsreels. But you know, funny thing I noticed made me think maybe they did see something. This was 1947, 2 years after the war. I noticed there were reports coming out, the first ones, about unidentified flying objects. This was the beginning of all that with the Martians and the flying saucers. 1947. Suddenly, 1947, all these unidentified flying objects were showing up. Then, just like they say today, some people were saying they saw the people from inside the spaceship. Just like they say today. They said they saw the people who were coming from Mars. And the people they saw had big bald heads. And they had skinny arms and skinny legs and large eyes. Always the large eyes in those big heads on those skinny little bodies. Now I said to myself, I've seen these people before. I've seen these people before. I've seen those thin, tiny, skinny bodies. I've seen those bald heads bobbing up and down. I've seen those large eyes. Eyes that were everywhere, staring. Eyes seeing everything, seeing nothing. I've seen these people before. And my cousin, a dentist in California, he'd also seen these people before. He saw them in the newsreels. I saw them on Mars. Burying the cemetery, a man. How do you destroy an entire people? Think about it. It's not an easy thing to do. It is not only killing millions of individuals, though it is certainly that, and it is not only degrading their culture, their way of life, though it is certainly also that. But to destroy a people, you also have to wipe out every trace, the slightest possible trace of their existence. You have to destroy all that people. Not only that they ever lived, but also that they ever died. Late in the war, one of the camps I was in, our job was to dig up the corpses of those whom the Germans had killed earlier. This happened in many of the places where they didn't have crematoria. There were mass graves, huge burial trenches all over Poland and Russia, the Baltics. People had been shot or gassed or just buried alive. They didn't want to waste bullets. Little children especially were often buried alive. So our job was to dig up the corpses. And the German and Ukrainian guards screamed and beat us while we piled the bodies onto huge pyres. Then they poured gasoline on the bodies and set them on fire. And this camp, even burning the bodies was not the end. They also took the gravestones from the Jewish cemeteries in that area. And many of the stones had us break up to turn them into gravel, to use to pave the muddy roads. And some were brought in to be stone platforms like workbenches when we were burning the bodies. After the bodies were burned, we had to collect all the ashes and put them on the workbenches, on the gravestones. And if there were any large pieces of bone or even little pieces, the SS made us grind them up. We had other pieces of stone from the gravestone, so we were able to grind all the pieces of bone into a fine gray powder. The chief SS officer had a sieve that he carried, and all the prisoners had to bring him the ashes they had ground up. All the remains of the people had to be able to pass through the sieve. At the end, gravestones that we were using as workbenches were also ground up. The gravel and the ashes were mixed together with sand, spread around in the soil. Then more soil was added over that, and grass seed was laid down. After a few weeks, the grass started coming up. It looked just like any other meadow. There was no sign that anything unusual had ever happened there. And that's how the Germans murdered the murder of my people, and how we buried the cemetery. Missing persons, a woman. Some of the stories we tell, some of the things that happened, even I myself find hard to believe. Like, I have a very good friend. She was in Berlin, just outside Berlin during the war. She was never sent to Auschwitz or any of the other camps. She was just living there on false names, the false identification. She was not even from there. Her family were German-speaking Jews who lived in Czechoslovakia. So nobody in Berlin knew her, and they didn't know she was Jewish. To them, she was just a German girl working in a clothing factory. making uniforms outside Berlin. In Czechoslovakia, she had friends, non-Jewish friends who were helping her parents. So she was able to find out what was going on, and she heard from these friends that her parents and her little brother and her sister had been taken to Theresienstadt. Now, Theresienstadt was a camp, but it was not considered as bad. This was because the Germans kept it as a kind of show place, camp where they cared for their prisoners. Then, at the end of 1943, they took my friend's family to Auschwitz. She found out because even in Auschwitz, the Czech Jews from Theresienstadt were kept for a while in a special camp. And they were made to write postcards about how well they were being treated there. Friends of her family received one of these postcards. They did not believe what was written. They knew it was a trick. And so did my friend. And in fact, there was no more word from her parents or her little brother or her sister. They'd all been taken to the gas. My friend did not know exactly what happened, but she knew that her family was gone. This was already 1944, and almost all the Jews were gone. They were gone from Germany. They were gone from Czechoslovakia. Millions of Jews were gone from Poland. So my friend, she did a crazy thing. She herself does not know why she did it. Maybe it was despair. Maybe she no longer wanted to live. Maybe she really was crazy and she didn't know what she was doing. But she called Gestapo headquarters. She just called them up on the telephone, the very people who were taking the Jews away. And when the Gestapo officer answered the phone and asked her what she wanted, she said she would like to report a missing person. And who is missing? The Gestapo officer asked. And my friend said that her mother was missing. She had been in Theresienstadt and then she'd been put on a train. Now she was missing. Then my friend said that her father was also missing. And a little sister, a little brother. She gave the Gestapo officer their names just as though it was normal circumstances. And then she described them for him so he would know them if he found them. My mother has long, flowing, beautiful red hair and freckles. My father is a strong, handsome man. He's tall. He used to play a lot of soccer. My little brother is 8 years old. He has red hair and freckles like my mother. My little sister is 6. She is dark and strong like my father. And the Gestapo officer took all the information. Apparently, he was very polite. He promised to call her back if he heard anything about the whereabouts of her family. And how can I get in touch with you? He asked. And my friend told him where she lived. She told him the truth. And she told him where she worked and what she looked like. She told him more than they would ever need if they wanted to find her. But they never did find her. Never called. Never came. He never heard anything from them. Maybe they assumed she was crazy. Maybe they assumed she was already dead. Dolls, a woman. All they did on Kristallnacht was decapitate my dolls. I had a wonderful collection. I was a little girl who loved all her dolls. And we were lucky. Somebody warned us they were coming. When we returned to the apartment, the dolls were sitting together, leaning against each other on our dining table. And their heads were all cut off. My husband and I went back to my hometown in November '88. And we had a wonderful time, truly. It was totally gemütlich. The people couldn't have been nicer. This was for the 50th anniversary of the Kristallnacht. They invited all the Jews from my hometown who had survived. And they had an exhibit called All the Jewish People Around the World, with a big chart that looks just like my son's in our basement. His is called Sea Mammals of the World. All the seals and whales and porpoises and the places where they live in my hometown, and all the Jewish people around the world. Israeli Jews wore little kibbutz hats. Russian Jews had violins. American Jews had round and happy faces. And the Argentine Jews wore colorful clothes. And dolls, too. They were selling dolls, too. Jewish people around the world dolls, just like the American Indian dolls we have in this country, in America, all dressed up in native clothes. And a lovely little girl came running up to me. A German girl from my hometown. And she had one of these dolls, a little blonde German Jewish doll. And she put it in my hands, and she said, "This is Elsie, and she's Jewish, and I love her." She put it right in my hands. "Show me Elsie." And how much she loved her. And my husband turned completely pale. I swear to God, he was absolutely white. He knows me well. He reads my mind. But I didn't do anything. I just gave it back. I did nothing at all. I just gave it back.
didn't tear its head off?
How to survive a man. Whenever I speak, somebody always asks me, how did you survive? That's what they always want to know. How did I survive? What gave me the strength to go on? What gave me the hope to get through? I don't know why they always ask this. Maybe because today, everybody wants to be some kind of survivor. Like, I go to the bookstore, and I look at the books, and they have How to Survive the Loss of a Love, and the Survival Manual for Young Parents. Then they have Surviving the Breakup, if you're going to get a divorce, and the Step Family Survival Guide, if you're going to get together. Doesn't matter if you're losing people or you're gaining them. It's survival either way. And everybody wants to be some kind of survivor. So, I was curious. I decided to read one of these survival books. This was Norman Cousins, a Jewish guy. And he wrote The Anatomy of an Illness. Have you read it? It's about how he survived an illness. In Norman Cousins, he got some kind of bad arthritis. In the meantime, he had a lousy doctor. So, he gets another opinion, finds a doctor who lets him do whatever he wants. So what does he want to do? He takes a lot of vitamin C, he watches a lot of funny movies, and he laughs. And eventually, his arthritis goes away. He says that laughter and jokes give a big boost to the immune system. Apparently, the immune system has a sense of humor. Anyway, Norman Cousins, he says if you want to survive, you should look at the bright side, watch the comedians, find a doctor who's not a sourpuss. That's how Norman Cousins survived. I'll tell you though. For me, it was different. What helped me survive? They don't write it in a book. Not any of the books that I looked at. And I don't think they're going to put it in Reader's Digest either. Because I don't think people really want to read this. See, what helped me survive was not jokes and funny movies and looking at the bright side. No, not at all. What helped me survive was hatred. Pure, undiluted hatred. And the wish for revenge. So when I was in the camp, and I looked at that SS man with the machine gun in the tower, I said to myself, one day, I'm going to have that machine gun. One day, I'm going to be up in that tower. See, this is the power of hatred. The power to stay alive. To stay alive because I looked at that SS son of a bitch. And I said to myself, I'm going to survive you. I'm going to survive you. You will be torn to pieces. And I will go on. And thank God I did. Thank God I did. Shema Yisrael. Thank God I did. The vanity of a woman. Whenever I'm introduced as a survivor, I'm a little bit uncomfortable. I mean, what do people want? What do they expect? In the beginning, until just the last few years, nobody wanted to hear from us. Everybody said, this is to forget. Life goes on. Hush up your bad dreams. Like, this may sound silly, but we heard in this country, when you laugh, the whole world laughs with you. And when you cry alone. So that's exactly what we did. We said, we're Americans too, and we are. And we kept our memories to ourselves. Now, today, everybody makes a big deal out of it. I mean, they don't just invite us to speak, but they turn us into some kind of heroes. They talk about the special wisdom we're supposed to have and the precious legacy we're supposed to pass on. And all the tales and legends we're supposed to be able to retell. What is this? A bar mitzvah? A celebration of our Jewish roots? I mean, we, whose roots were totally destroyed, are supposed to have a precious legacy? And we, who can hardly speak at all, are supposed to tell you fabulous tales and legends? In the beginning, people were silent. Today, they are stupid. But I'll tell you, I'm stupid too. I don't have wisdom. I don't even know what I think. I mean, I lived through it. I remember it. But even I don't know what the Holocaust means or what we should believe about it. One memory I'll tell you, then maybe you'll understand this stupidity of mine. You know, I was part of the time in Birkenau. Birkenau. That was the part of Auschwitz where they had the gas chambers in the shower room and the crematoria. Birkenau was where they killed most of the people in Auschwitz. And I was in the group of prisoners who sorted the clothes of those who had already been gassed and burnt. After they went into the shower room, the gas chamber, we came out and packed up the clothes they left behind. And also in Birkenau, there was the prisoners' latrine. You know, where we went to the toilet, which was really just a bench with a row of holes over a pit filled with quicklime. So this was where we went to the bathroom. And in the latrine of Birkenau, the SS took one lady, one of the prisoners, and they made her the Scheißkapo. This was a joke for the SS. It means the shit commander. That was her title. It was on a sign she wore around her neck. And her job was to watch the toilets and be like a kind of attendant. She had to keep it neat and clean. One day I noticed this lady, Scheißkapo, had managed to find a few boxes. Somehow she got a couple of old crates made of wood, and she put them together with a little one in front so she could sit on it. And she also had a little mirror that she probably found in her clothes. One of the prisoners who had been killed. So with the boxes and the mirror, she made like a little bureau. She put the mirror over the big box and she sat on the little box and made like a little vanity in the corner of the latrine. a little vanity in the corner of the ladies' room. Whenever people ask me, what does the Holocaust mean? Or I ask myself, what does it mean? I think about this memory. It's not easy to do. Try to keep the picture, all the elements of the picture, together in your mind at one time. A vanity in the latrine in Auschwitz-Birkenau. Now you tell me because I don't know myself. Does it inspire your hope or your revulsion that the attendants in the toilets of hell made a place to put on her makeup? Thank you. So no more machine guns, no more shtick either, probably, which is fun. But as I said, this is really the part of this that I most enjoyed. So questions, comments, reflections are all welcome, please.
Okay, first of all, a statement and a question. Statement. I will call this a quintessential performance. Performance. And I wrote down 4 adjectives that just came to my mind. Impressive, brilliant, powerful, and flawless.
It wasn't, but anyway.
Yeah. Have you ever, this is without hyperbole, have you ever thought of going on Broadway and doing this? And calling it Holocaust Remnants?
First of all, it's a little short for Broadway, but you know, we need to add. No, you know what? It turns out by accident that one of the first performances that I did as a one-person thing was actually in a nice off-Broadway theater, Hausman Theater on whatever it was. But it was, in a way, by accident. It was part of a festival, and it was whatchamacallit, that comedy political troupe. Anyway, it was their off night, so the theater was dark, so the festival got to use it. That's how I ended up, quote, off-Broadway. Next time I did it was in Manhattan, Kansas. And Kansas City. So it was kind of like, so it's been moving away from Broadway ever since. Now we're close again. You know what? I don't see it anyway like that, and I honestly don't. I mean, I obviously appreciate your very kind words. You know, I don't think of myself as an actor. These are, you know, some are composites, I should say, but they're based on people I know. And you know, it makes it very easy then a character from wherever, even though we also base characters from wherever, usually on people we know. Still, what I see I'm doing is kind of when we quote a friend. I was telling someone earlier, you know, we say, so Jane said, whatever. And we kind of become Jane to some extent when we're quoting Jane to our other friend. We take on her lilts, her tones, etc., to whatever extent. That's what I see myself doing. I'm, you know, kind of borrowing from my friends and, you know, using my body, obviously, voice to convey some of what I heard them say. It's not verbatim. That's another thing we can talk about, but I want to go off too long now. But it's okay, the gist of what they said, and some of it is exactly what they said, and some of it is honed and shaped and what have you. Thank you. Please.
But as we reach the point in our lives where the last of the Janes will soon be gone, this represents the next generation really being able to tell it.
Yeah. You know,
And the recordings that are,
yeah. I will say, and this has been consistent for me, there is no way in which I see what I do as being either a substitute for or even a carrying on of hearing survivors themselves directly. And this is not modesty, it's just a very different thing. It's a dramatic piece. As I said, it's shaped, it's condensed. One quick story which kind of illustrates. Years ago, I was going to do a performance, and the woman who's my beloved friend, Augie Rubin, who we wrote a book together, and her story's vanity. She'd seen the piece a million times. She just wanted to do me a favor. And I said, you know, I'm kind of tired, blah, blah, blah. She said, maybe I can do my part. And this is hard to confess, but you know, what went through my head was, no, it's my play. You know, I know, this is like the real survivor. Like, you're not supposed to say that, right? And Augie spoke all the time as Augie, but not through my play. And this is not, I didn't say this, but it's not Saturday Night Live, you know, where those of us old enough, where Sarah Palin shows up, or George W. shows up to, anyway. It's just a different genre. It's a different thing. I sometimes justify this. People know I Should Live So Long, the wonderful work of Anna Deavere Smith, Fires in the Mirror, and she does verbatim. I don't. But, you know, among other people, you know, she does some well-known people. But if they showed up and said, Anna, you know, I think I'll do me tonight, and I'm pretty sure she'd say, no, you won't. You know? Again, it's a different genre. It's a different kind of thing. So luckily we have many genres. We have memoir, we have whatever this is, we have real people to engage as long as we do. We have videos and holograms. Sometimes I scare myself when I say, am I some kind of weird hologram? I mean, anyway, people know that they're making holograms of some survivors is the Joan Foundation. Anyway, so yeah, I mean, I hesitate for that reason. And also, as I was telling someone earlier, my graduate committee, when I first proposed in the 70s doing a project, my dissertation on this topic, I was told by not a few people that all the work on survivors has already been done in 1975. And anyway, the survivors are all dying. That was 43 years ago, right? It's kind of impressive. I mean, and it wasn't just the people in my graduate committee. You know, this was, so how to understand this? I think, you know, so many people had that image from that we've seen, those clips from the newsreels in 45, and people immersed in seas of corpses, and, you know, that sort of natural, like, how could they have a life after? How could they not be on some level? How could they really have survived? Survivors themselves asked that question. As one in our area famously said, it's not normal, we're so normal, you know? And anyway, that kind of comment. So it is a mystery. I don't think, as a psychologist, we get it. I think I've always said that, I mean, we have much more to learn from survivors than the other way around. But anyway, you know, this notion, so I'm allergic, you know, as I get things in the mail and I read the article, the survivors are all, like, obviously now demographically, it's real, it's true. The people in this piece are mostly gone. People I interviewed, certainly back in the 70s, are virtually all gone. The one surviving person is the woman who was a kid, Boyce, the first monologue. She actually came, to my honor, to a performance in Ann Arbor some months ago. Didn't know she would be there. And it also sort of hit me, like, as my beloved Augie used to say, we're the last of the Mohicans. The last of that way of life, you know, that was buried with a cemetery. Or she also said, the life we were made to live is gone, we're alive in another life. You spend hours, now I'm probably like this quoting Augie, is always in my head. So we're losing people, and obviously for me it's quite personal too. I'll just say this and I'll shut up. I think, this is what I really believe. I think we need to let survivors die. And I say that's provocative, but what I mean is, We need to let them be us, which means let us be them. Human beings are mortal. And rather than trying to construct, I mean, I'm not against second generation work that people continue to tell their parents' stories. I'm not against most of the hologram stuff. But, you know, we have lots of ways. And obviously we always have Primo Levi and Elie Wiesel and the Memoirs, you know. So it's not over by any means. But as far as survivors personally, I think we need, again, to let them be just like us in that sense. Not to put them in a special category, which you can do, as the piece suggests, by, I saw the newsreels, you know, cooties. And I sometimes say you could also do it by kudos, like in the last monologue. Make a big deal out of it and put us on stage. And, you know, a podium can be as stigmatizing as the consulting room. Either one allows people to quite be on the same planet as we are. We do this with a lot of people whose experience scares us. People with obvious disabilities, cancer patients to some extent, become like, that's the headline and everything else they are is sort of the backstory. I've been fighting that one for a long time. So, yeah, I just think for that reason.
That can be their choice.
Sorry?
That can be their choice.
Yeah, of course, indeed, yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, thank you. Please.
You said you've been meeting with survivors for over 40 years, approximately 40 years.
Yeah.
I'm just curious, how many have you, with whom have you met?
Yeah, I mean, it's not that many because, as you heard, my approach is to meet with people over time. You know, someone asked me that, a colleague recently, it's probably in the hundreds, so it's not like a zillion, no.
And all in this country?
Yes, and all, mostly, some actually from this part of the country, but mostly in the southeast Michigan, Toledo area. So, yeah, you know, and, right. It's not a, quote, representative sample, not that I know what that is. But again, these kind of special moments, what I call gifts, happen only occasionally in any conversation with anybody. So it's not like there's this whole other long group of potential monologues. There's some, but not that many. I've imagined that the guy who is Manny from Mars, who is a character in 1,000 ways. He influences a little bit of the How to Survive guy too, the funny guy, when he's funny, before he blows. I won't do it here, but I've imagined doing a piece. His name was Abe. We've also lost him. Just called Abe. And there are so many, as with Augie, moments over the course of knowing him. And he's the kind of, he's a very quotable guy. So anyway, I've imagined a piece, short piece, but it would just be Abe. A night with Abe, something like that. Please.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I think that, to me, one of the tremendous reasons that we have to continue to talk about the Holocaust and study it, not forget it, is something that I think it's Bennett from Israel Battalion said, we don't want 5,000 years from now for people to say it didn't happen, as a lot say now.
Mhm.
You know, I think that's critical.
Yeah. Yeah. I don't want to get into the politics of the Middle East, but no, but you're talking about denial, obviously.
The idea of that.
What I say typically or think about denial is, on one level, denial was inherently part of the Holocaust, right? Denial was part of the Holocaust. You were going to go take a shower. You're going to go get work in the East.
Yeah.
Fake train stations. So to me, Holocaust denial is a kind of a direct continuation of aspects of the Holocaust itself, with the same, at least for those who know what they're doing, and they usually do, not the naives, but the ones who are, you know, putting it out. It's hatefulness, it's cruelty, it's sadism, it's whatever, you know, any such word one wants to say. In terms of thousands of years, here I go grim again. But what I say, sometimes people, like, what will we be remembering, and how do I know? But I say, to some extent, it'll depend on what else happens. At this point, the Holocaust, in its particular horror, which is not, I didn't say unique horror, but it's particular horror. Well, it is, yeah. I mean, this becomes another discussion also, but given that it happened, and it means anything can happen. That's what I said about letting survivors and those who are even harder for us to imagine, which is the vast majority who didn't survive. They're us. We are all vulnerable, and that's part of my sermon too. But obviously it's true if you're a certain, quote, race, a certain ethnicity, and live in a certain place and have certain privileges, you're less likely to be a target of genocide than otherwise. But all of us can be, depending on...
That's why it's so important.
Well, exactly. This whole never again, and sometimes it's a little bit ridiculed because, well, never again, and then Rwanda and Cambodia, and it's true. But I say, it's never again for us. It's not just other poor people who may become victims. It could be us. All of us. This is part of human history. And I think, again, ideally, easy to say. I know we know this, but to really own it, I say, the human family is a euphemism. We're not a human family unless you had a really bad family. I mean, we do what Erik Erikson, for the olders among us will remember, a well-known psychologist in his day, used to call pseudo-speciation, which was a fancy way of saying we turn different groups of humans into different species as though they're not really part of the human community. But which is what race theory was all about, still is. This kind of person, we're not really a person, et cetera, et cetera. We're a long way from anything resembling a human family. So it's to aspire toward, but anyway, it's for all of us. Please.
Over the course of all those interviews, did you ever come across a story that you felt you just could not tell in this kind of medium?
Great question.
Would you repeat the question?
Yeah, the question, I'm sorry, was, did I ever hear a story or that I felt I just could not tell?
Well, and also, I should add that as kind of underscored in the first story, like it is, you are using your voice as they use their voice to convey it to you, but sometimes, it takes somebody who's had that experience.
Yeah, absolutely.
To use the voice to share it.
Right. Yeah, no, I agree. It becomes a question of whose voice really is it, and another issue, but I can't think of a specific one, but I mean, it wasn't, because again, it had to do with metaphors, but I heard people talk about being raped, including men. Could I create a monologue, or would I? I'm not sure. Probably not. Rare, but instances of cannibalism that happen at times in extreme circumstances during the Holocaust, as in other extreme circumstances. I doubt I could turn that into one of these kinds of monologues if I, or would want to. And I don't feel, I mean, the only one of these segments that really is a scene of atrocity is Burying the Cemetery, and even that is, I'm not going to say mild, but I mean, it's the only direct imagery of digging up corpses and grounding up bone. The others point to things, but are not explicit in that particular way. All I'll say is, I'm not sure. I mean, you make choices, as you're suggesting. I don't know what explicit ultimately is in terms of, no matter what, even if I did talk about, or even if there was a segment on cannibalism, or would that be somehow more something? It would be whatever it is, but I'm not sure it would necessarily capture. Please, go ahead.
I mean, I guess it depends on why you're writing it. If you're trying to present it to a more general audience, those kinds of stories, of course.
It's partly that.
But maybe
Yeah.
if your intent is to
Right. Yeah, it's to suggest, I mean, again, in 40 minutes, what can you do? And the particular images that make up much of this piece, space aliens, a vanity, Norman Cousins, are not, and also the emotion. Rage is not one of the ones. It figures fairly centrally in this piece. Dolls, who sort of cocks the trigger, but doesn't fire, and then what everyone calls the angry guy who does do what she didn't do. Horrible. And horrible to feel that. It's poison. But I always get questions about survivor guilt, and these days trauma, 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 trauma. Rarely about survivor loss, which is the most essential experience of being a survivor, right? You're still here, and the rest aren't, as Augie said, the Mohegans. And also, sometimes people say, well, I'm not sure about that anger thing that survivors do. Well, not everybody, obviously, but some number. So where I was going was that I deliberately chose, partly because they were what they were, but also metaphors and images that came from survivors, but were not iconic of this history. So yeah, there are trains, but there's maybe there's no barbed wire, I don't think. But anyway, so much now, not in the 70s, but now about this history has become kind of iconic. Certain rhetoric, certain imagery, even the word testimony. That I think this piece, goes out of its way to get around or under that.
I think it's more effective because of that.
I think, thank you, and it is my goal. I mean, it's kind of like what we were saying about survivors dying. Maybe this is overstated, but I think when, some word goes out that there's going to be this piece on survivor testimony or something, I would feel the same. A lot of people say, been there, heard that. Now, not in the 70s, but now. So, I take it as a kind of a point of something to get under that fence and to make it, to that extent, unexpected, new. So when I'm doing Mars, and the guys talking about us, I can see it in your faces. People thinking, what is this? When I do the beginning of How to Survive, and the guy's doing shtick about the bookstore and how to survive, this and that, when people laugh at the one joke, the immune system with a sense of humor, as some of you did, I feel I got him. Because it's like at that moment, you kind of forgot, to some extent, that this was a piece about the Holocaust. And you were watching shtick, which means that when he comes around with it's, from my perspective, more powerful to do it that way. So anyway, some of the choices. Thank you. Someone?
We have one more question.
It's okay, a few hands, but.
Yeah.
Hey, I would like to say thank you because it made me take a look at my ancestry, the African American, and the connection with my brothers and sisters that who were Jews. When I kept hearing the thing of survivor, that's powerful for me because I think of my grandmother, my great grandmother. How they made it through Jim Crow. That's a survival mode because I'm still here.
Mm-hmm.
They made it through the Middle Passage, like the brothers and sisters that were Jews who made it through Poland, or they made it through Czechoslovakia and all the things. We made it through the trains and all of that craziness.
Right.
We made it through the slavery.
Right.
Middle passages and all of that. So when you were doing that little part about surviving and all of that, surviving over marriage, surviving over this, surviving over that, I sat here and instead of just thinking of real, I went to, in this new age, they have HD or Ultra HD.
As
I was
in,
thinking in a high definition mode because, there's a big connection with my Jewish brothers and sisters in my culture. And they are the main Jew who are still trying to survive to this day.
Indeed,
in this country
Indeed.
and over there.
Right.
We're still trying to.
indeed, indeed. I thank you for what you said, and I mean, there's nothing to say in response other than thank you, but a last story. Because it has to do with, quote, uniqueness and how we can learn from each other. I had the great honor of spending a semester in Montreal, and it was a project mainly focused on those who found refuge in Montreal from torture and genocide, mostly French-speaking, that's why Montreal. So there were Haitians, there were Rwandans, there were Cambodians, some Holocaust survivors, particularly from countries that were Southern Europe and, you know, more French-oriented than even German or Yiddish-oriented. And it was, I don't even know how to describe it. There's a certain exhilaration to sit in a room. And I mean, it almost sounds like a weird joke about people in a bar, but I mean, it's like a Rwandan and a Cambodian and a Holocaust survivor are schmoozing about not like my history versus, I mean, nobody got confused about whose history was his, but there were some shared questions like, how do you talk to your kids? And one will say, well, I kind of did this, and the other, yeah, no, I did this, and et cetera. And it had nothing to do with weighing in, it was learning with each other from, you know, places where all those lines cross. There was another great discussion on, you know, in many countries, including Rwanda, survivors are honored sort of ceremonially, but not necessarily. They also went through a period of, you know, I saw the newsreels, I don't want to hear a word about it. So, and so did Cambodians. And so people talked about that, being stigmatized as survivors, as genocide survivors, as Haitians. And it was, I mean, it was just something exhilarating, is the only word, to like see how people were learning from each other and finding ways to do that. And just to be in the room together was fantastic.
So, maybe we can, because we have our class, which is going to continue over in D building, right? Yeah. Thank you very much.